we're going to discuss how to convert terminating decimals to fractions. Little review of some vocabulary. A terminating decimal is a decimal with a finite number of decimal places. And remember, by finite number, we mean a specific number. So if you have a decimal that has only 2 decimal places, and then it ends, or your decimal has 10 decimal places, then it ends. No matter what, you're dealing with a decimal that ends. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at today, are terminating decimals and how to turn them into fractions. So we've got some steps to go through. So to convert a decimal to a fraction, what are we going to do? So we'll go through these steps together. You may already know what to do. So if you feel like you do, let's see if you are correct. All right, step 1. The first thing we're going to do is determine the denominator by counting the number of digits to the right of the decimal. I ran into step number 2 a little bit here, so hopefully you have enough room. Step 2. So step 1, we figured out the denominators. For step 2, we'll look at the numerator. The numerator is the number to the right of the decimal. So for the denominator, we count how many digits are behind the decimal or to the right of the decimal. For the numerator, we actually look at the numbers that are to the right of the decimal. And step 3, simplify if possible. All right, let's take a look at some examples. Example 1, convert 52 hundredths to a fraction. So step 1 tells us for the denominator, we count how many digits are behind the decimal. So if I have 2 digits, that means my denominator is going to be 100. So for each digit behind the decimal, we have a 0 in our power of 10. So for each decimal place, or I could say this, each decimal place equals a 0 in the power of 10. Remember our powers of 10, 10, 100, 1,000. So the number of decimal places, determine the power of 10. So I have 2 decimal places, I have 2 zeros in my power of 10. Step 2 tells us to actually look at the digits after the decimal. I have a 5 and a 2. 52 over 100. If you want to get even easier, if you read that decimal correctly and mathematically, the fraction actually happens. What I mean by that is this. Let's read that decimal correctly. 52 hundredths. If I read this fraction mathematically, it's 52 hundredths. A decimal and a fraction are read the same exact way when we're dealing with a denominator with powers of 10. A decimal automatically is set up in a power of 10. So if you read the decimal to yourself, you get the answer. Step 3 is to simplify. That means we want to look for a common factor to divide out. 2 is divisible by both. So I get 26 over 50. I can still simplify by dividing out a 2. You may have thought that you could divide a 4 out from the beginning, and you definitely could have done that. Your final answer would be 13/25. Example 2. We're going to convert 613 thousandths to a fraction. Now, if reading this decimal correctly makes sense, we can get straight to the answer. This is 613 thousandths. Remember our place value? We have tenths. The 6 is in the tenths place. The 1 is in the hundredths place. The 3 is in the thousandths place. So I have 613 thousandths. It could be as simple as that. If you're struggling on how to read a fraction, or how to read a decimal, then we can go through the steps. Step 1, count the number of digits behind the decimal. 1, 2, 3. That tells me my denominator will have 3 zeros. For the numerator, I actually take the digits to the right of the decimal, and I make that my numerator. That's it. Example 3. What happens when I have a digit to the left of the decimal? So far, all we've talked about are what are the digits to the right. What happens when there's a digit to the left? If you think about what this means as a number, does the 8 represent part of something or a whole something? So remember, a fraction is a part of something. If you just have digits to the right of a decimal, that's not quite 1. It's a part of something. But what happens when with this 8? Is this 8 a partial number or is it a whole number? It's a whole number. So what happens with fractions when you have a whole number and a part of a number? Hopefully, you remembered that you end up with a mixed number. In fractions, when you have a whole and a part, you get a mixed number. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. So this 8 started out as a whole number. It stays as a whole number. It does not, the status of that number doesn't change. It's a whole number. So I have 8. Then I've got the 32 hundredths over here. So I have 8 and 32 hundredths. Again, if you think about that, if I told you write the fraction 8 and 32 hundredths, what would you write? So again, think about this. If I told you to write a fraction and the numbers I gave you were 8 and 32 hundredths, it would look like this, right? If you want to use the steps never talk about digits to the left. But from what we just talked about, you know that 8 stays whole. So the 8 stays whole. Then if we go through the steps, we count how many digits are after the decimal. There are 2 digits. So my denominator will be 100. I have 2 zeros in my denominator. Then I look at step 2 says the numerator becomes the actual digits to the right of the decimal. My actual digits are 32. So my whole number stays whole. I get 8 32/100ths. Now I definitely want to simplify, and I get 8 16/50. Divide that by 2, and I get 8 8/25. Finally, we have our guided practice. So we're going to convert 14/10 to a fraction. So right now I want you to pause, try it on your own, and then you'll come back and check your answer. All right. You should have gotten 14/100, which will simplify to 7/50ths. Our last example for guided practice, you're going to convert 2 3/10 to a fraction. So you'll hit pause, copy the question, get your answer. When you're ready, come back and let's see how you did. Right. Your answer should have been 2 3/10.